Well, museums have never been neutral. They tell stories that are curated in response. Hold on. Okay. Right, can you see my slides now? I hope you can. Okay, I'll just go ahead anyway. So museums have never been neutral. They tell stories that are curated in response to a specific need in society, aiming to reflect cultural, political, or stylistic trends through a carefully constructed lens. This is especially true when intellectual dialogues turned political, rendering compromises in the selection and display of art inevitable. Today, I am going to take the world tour of the Balaton shipwreck material as an example to examine how seemingly impartial practices like selection of objects, choice of venues, methods of display, narrative strategies, and exhibition designs can silently and yet effectively mediate how a story about a sunken ship is told. The shipwreck in question was discovered by the fishermen in 1998, just outside the island of Balaton of Indonesia, and hence the name Balaton shipwreck. Soon after the discovery, the Indonesian government, being aware of reports of looting, quickly authorized a selfish company named Seabed Exploration to recover the cargo. Over the course of 2 seasons, from September 1998 to June 1999, the company retrieved some 60,000 objects. The result of the excavation was published in a brief report authored by the marine archaeologist Michael Flecker. At the same time, the finds were moved to New Zealand, where they were stored, catalogued, and conserved at the company's laboratory there. In 2005, the Singaporean government joined force with the Sentosa Leisure Group to acquire the entire cargo at approximately $32 million US. In 2011, the world debut exhibition of the collection of artifacts, as well as some timbers from the ship, took place in the Art Science Museum in Singapore. The display was put on with the collaboration of the Smithsonian Institution, more specifically, the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery in Washington, DC, the Singapore Tourism Board, as well as the National Heritage Board of Singapore. The exhibition was then scheduled to travel the world for approximately 5 years to venues including major museums in Asia, Australia, Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. In 2015, the collection was handed over to the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore, who built a new wing to provide a permanent home for the Balaton materials. Let's take a quick look at the wreck and the cargo now. Parts of the hull of the wooden ship survived the ravages of the ocean and time, although none of them was documented in detail and few were taken out of water. Despite the scant amount of information about the ship, it is generally accepted that the vessel was within the reach of the Western Indian Ocean, and it gave us the first trading ship constructed to ply the waters between West Asia and East Asia. Based on inscribed coins and a stylistic analysis of the artifacts on board, the cargo has been dated to the 2nd quarter of the 9th century, making it the earliest known Chinese cargo ever found. Among the 60,000 objects retrieved by seabed explorations, close to 59,000 were ceramic. Out of those ceramic objects, more than 57,000 items were changsha ware, and the large majority of them were polychrome painted bowls like the one shown on the screen. While changsha wares have routinely been found at various sites at coastal regions in the Indian Ocean rim, they are rarely seen or known within China, and hence attracting a large amount of attention from scholars of Chinese ceramics. Apart from the Chinese ceramic cargo, other types of trade goods were on board the ship too. For instance, star anise, native to South China and Vietnam, was found inside green glazed jars and scattered throughout the wreck site. A number of Chinese gold and silver utensils were found to concentrate in a very small area adjacent to several high quality green splashed wares and whiteware ceramics. It is very likely that silk was part of the cargo, and it was probably the most valuable commodities on board the ship. But silk deteriorated in the ocean over time and became invisible at the excavation site and subsequently in exhibitions. As said earlier, the Belaton exhibition debuted in Singapore in 2011, was going to travel the world to venues across the continent. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. was scheduled to receive the exhibition in early 2012. However, they had to cancel it at the last minute because of strong opposition from communities of archaeologists and anthropologists in the US. The opponents condemned the exhibition on the basis of the time frame and the nature of the excavation. They felt strongly about the fact that the excavation was for commercial gain. It was conducted so quickly that it caused a loss of information pertaining to the crew and the cargo. Also, the site was not properly excavated nor documented according to internationally accepted standards. Thus, exhibiting the artifacts would be against international agreements on underwater excavations. On top of that, exhibiting the materials at a state-funded public museum like the Smithsonian would give the false impression that profit-driven excavation activities like that received endorsement from the state. Proceeding with the exhibition would therefore not only severely damage the stature and reputation of the institution, but also violate the institution's own set of professional ethics. At the same time, proponents of the arguments for display of the works claimed that the excavation was actually legal. It was carried out in accordance with Indonesian law, as well as international laws at that time. Moreover, in recognition of the importance of the discovery of the earliest datable Chinese cargo, historians, including eminent ones like Victor Meyer, argued that the educational and historical value of the collection was so enormous that those who called for the cancellation of the exhibition were, in effect and in fact, denying access to the wealth of information embodied in the Belaton shipwreck to the lay public and to qualified researchers. Mayer's opinion was supported by some archaeologists who embellished it with the point about using the exhibition to raise awareness among the public of the issues concerning unethical or illegal excavation of underwater cultural heritage sites. In the end, the Smithsonian gave in and called off the exhibition. While acknowledging the archaeologists' noble intention to boycott unethical salvage of underwater cultural heritage, historians and art historians, myself included, lament the lost opportunity to learn about the important cargo and the ship which sank in the South China Sea in the middle of the 9th century. After all, not everyone could afford a trip to the ship's newfound home in Singapore to see the material there. The controversy over the Belaton exhibition brings to the fore the varying interests among the many different constituent groups of a museum. Understandably, each constituent group has its own interests, needs, desires, and priorities. This understanding and managing those different sets of needs, desires, priorities becomes a critical step in museum and exhibition planning. This, however, leads to the important and fundamental question, what are museums for? Whose voices should museums advocate? or whose voices do museums want us to hear? The controversy surrounding Belaton exhibitions also make one wonder how many exhibitions have been called off out of concerns of controversy without us museum goers knowing it. That is to say, what we get to see in a museum is actually the result of a decision-making process that is highly selective and often a compromise between knowledge dissemination and those factors that lie well beyond it. Another question worth bearing in mind in this context is, how do museums of different sorts, say private versus public versus privately owned museums, or art museum versus science museum, how do they complement one another to tackle to deal with a difficult situation like that for Belaton exhibitions? Well, 2 years after the Smithsonian exhibition was called off, the world tour of the Belaton shipwreck was resumed. The exhibition first went to Aga Khan Museum in Toronto in 2014. Later, in 2017, it was put on display at the Asia Society Museum in New York. In either case, what was put on view was a significantly reduced version of the original one, and the exhibitions were kept fairly low-key upon opening. It is noteworthy that unlike the Freer and Sackler galleries, which are state-funded museums, both the Aga Khan Museum and the Asia Society Museum are non-profit organizations. This suggests to me that a different choice of venue seems to have provided a solution to the conundrum once faced by the Smithsonian Institution. As you can see in the pictures, both the 2014 and 2017 exhibitions were well attended, indicating a strong interest among the public. The visitors were probably drawn not only by the Belaton shipwreck material itself, but also by the controversy surrounding it. Nevertheless, despite the interest, the audience at the Asia Society Museum and also at Aga Khan Museum too only got to see a fraction of the cargo. Moreover, the thorny issue of unethical excavation of underwater cultural heritage was carefully shunned through a combination of exhibition narratives, object selection, exhibition design, and programming. The curatorial tools used by the Asia Society Museum to guide the audience attention to more favorable narratives like the Indian Ocean trade include, first of all, selection of objects. Only beautiful, intact objects are put on display. The damaged, fragmented wreck that could have provided useful contextual information for the artifacts was put aside. Secondly, the exhibition design the designer employed rather dramatic lighting to highlight select masterpieces, emphasizing their aesthetic values and accentuating their status as art objects as opposed to mass-produced goods for trade and consumption by the middle or upper middle class in Indian Ocean societies. As regards the exhibition narrative, it focused on the Indian Ocean trade and the connectivity of the medieval world. In terms of programming, the Asia Society designed a series of lectures, performances, and a symposium to accompany the exhibition, all of which focused on the Indian Ocean trade, and especially the production or Chinese side of the story. It is of interest at this point to note that the Asia Society also sponsored a symposium organized by NYU to take place 2 days before members' opening of that exhibition. With the intention to calibrate the research on Indian Ocean connectivity, the NYU Symposium included a set of talks that dealt with trading in the Western Indian Ocean, also with a hope to help the public understand the nature of the Belaton controversy. the NYU Symposium engaged a number of scholars and museum professionals in an extended roundtable discussion about archaeology in the era of capitalism. In my view, such a creative and collaborative relationship with academia created a win-win situation for the Asia Society Museum, where they could avoid getting into hot water with the controversy while also remaining associated with and on top of the current debate. Like the canceled Smithsonian show, the exhibition at the Asia Society Museum portrayed the Tang shipwreck as a time capsule into 9th century China, which was engaged in communications with other cultures via the maritime routes. It concentrated on the ceramic finds that demonstrated the role played by the market demand and taste in mass production toward exportation. The 10 essays in the book that accompanied the exhibition discussed topics ranging from the ceramics and the commodities on board, the ship's construction and possible origin, China's maritime trade in the Tang Dynasty, Chinese ceramic production, ports of call in Asia and Southeast Asia, and life on board the ship. In other words, both the exhibition and the catalog centered around trade of ceramics, the production side of the Indian Ocean trade, specifically China, featuring China as a key player in the Indian Ocean world during the medieval period. This approach to the Belaton shipwreck materials is in line with the installation of the Belaton material at the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. The permanent display at ACM privileges ceramics as an object type, and it follows a storyline that focuses more on the production, i.e. the Chinese, than the reception side of the Indian Ocean trade. As beautiful as the installation may be, such a method of display and choice of focus, in my view, risk causing the audience to believe in a maritime world that's dominated by China and its production power, by the trade of ceramics, and driven primarily by trade, which is far from being true. The approach adopted by the ACM and its counterparts in New York and Toronto resonates with museum practices in China and sets itself apart from Western museums, where rather different methods of display are adopted to explore a varied host of storylines. Take the Vasa Museum as an example. The centerpiece of the museum is, of course, the ship Vasa, which sank in 1628 and was raised in 1961. In addition to the ship itself, niches created at different corners of Vasa Museum to tell a range of stories surrounding the ship, including how the ship was built, what the voyage was supposed to be like, why the ship sank, how the wreck was recovered, how it was conserved, as well as the various groups of people that were responsible for the commissioning, building, sailing, sinking, and the salvage of the ship. The contrast between Vasa Museum and the ACM shows that depending on the place or the type of museum where the material is displayed, different selections of objects would be made, different strategies and styles of display would be adopted, and different modes of interpretations would be given. That is to say, the question about where to display and how to display go hand in hand in the exhibition planning process. By way of conclusion, I would like to advocate for students of art history, myself included, to exercise reverse engineering as they walk into a museum and visit an exhibition. I would encourage us to appreciate exhibitions within the context of curatorial practices and ask ourselves questions like what motivated the curator to take on or to not take on this particular project, whose voices is the curator trying to advocate through the exhibition, and what kind of objects are thus selected to fulfill the goal, what narratives are constructed using these objects, where and whereabouts inside the museum, or what kind of museum were chosen for display of the objects. And lastly, how are they displayed within that context? Only when we students of art history have done due diligence to examine exhibitions in this light, can we accurately assess the relevance of the exhibition content to the art history we would like to write. At the end of the day, the question for scholars and laymen alike remains, how adept will you become at perceiving a significant silence in the way a story is told or not told? Thank you.